Attention, you're listening to The Todd Huff Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk and education. Be advised, the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. And now, coming to you from the Full Suite Wealth Studios, here's your conservative but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Well, that is right, my friends. You've tuned in to America's home for conservative, not bitter host. I am the one, the only, the ever so loved, beloved, and benevolent host, Todd Huff. It's absolute pleasure to be here today. So I want to talk about the GDP for a moment here today, the economy. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened here to a councilman that the people on the deranged, godless, radical left are excusing the behavior that has been exhibited against this 38-year-old councilman who was doused with gasoline and set on fire. I want to talk about that. Other things in the news as well. You can get a glimpse of those things that I reference. If you want to read more about them, you can always go to our Stack of Stuff page on the website, toddhuffshow.com. And you'll see some things that we list there that we don't have time to get to as well. Thank you, my friends, here for tuning in this morning. So let's face it, there are a lot of companies out there, a whole lot of companies that do not share our Christian values. But the good news is that we don't have to invest in them. You know, that's one of the differences between the free market and government. It's why big government is a much bigger problem than big business. I'm not saying big business can't be a problem, but at least we have an opportunity to not engage with the big business that we don't want to engage with. You don't have that option when you're dealing with the government. But 4.8 Financial specializes in biblically responsible investing. And so what that means is that they help screen out companies that go against your faith and your values and create a plan that's tailored to your specific goals. And on top of that, they'll handle all of the heavy lifting so that you can focus on what really matters. Do you want to see what your current investments, what they are, and if they align with your values? If that's the case, all you have to do is go to 48financial.com/Todd. That's 48financial.com/Todd, and you can do their assessment. You can see where your money is invested and if your investments are in alignment with your values. I did the assessment. It's not hard to do. You can do it quickly and easily as well. 4.8 Financial, because your values matter, my friends, and so does your money. All right, let's talk here about the economy. After I got off the program yesterday, or we would have talked about this briefly yesterday, there was released numbers for Q2, the second quarter GDP. So second quarter, again, listen, I'm talking with folks here across the spectrum. Some of you have been following politics and following these things your entire life. Some of you for 50 plus years now, right? You're very well read. You know these things. You could discuss them yourself. Some folks have been following politics for 15 years or so, maybe 20. And you're getting more into it. Some folks may have kind of taken breaks from it along the way because, hey, you've got a life to live, right? You've got work to do. You've built a house, started a family, started a new job, maybe started a business, whatever. And so you know it, but it's sometimes helpful to have some reminders. And some folks are brand new to this. And this is what I love about this program, is that we have the opportunity to bring other people into the fold. We can talk with those who have followed it for 15, 20, 50 years, and also take little moments of pause to say, let's just do some basic stuff here. It's a refresher for those of us who've been doing this for a while, but for those who are newer to it, who may have been kind of forced into it, or maybe they're just, you're just younger and this is just part of your growth and you're learning about politics and your country and all this sort of stuff. So we're just going to do a quick little summation of what these things are. So GDP, every quarter, let's start there. Every quarter, there are reports. There's reports every month, but there's also reports that are quarterly. GDP is measured on a quarterly basis. And so we run on a calendar quarter, which is interesting because we're not on a fiscal year that's on a calendar. We're on a fiscal year, but it's October 1 is the start date of the fiscal year. But still, those are quarters, right? But when we talk about Q1, we talk about Q1 of the calendar year. January, February, March, that's the first quarter. April, May, June, that's the second quarter. And it takes some time to calculate the numbers and all that sort of stuff. So typically a few weeks after, up to maybe a month after, as we're at right now, that point, the numbers for the previous quarter. So at the end of July, you start to get numbers for the previous quarter. And that's what happened yesterday. We got numbers for quarter two, Q2. And numbers specifically for gross domestic product. That's GDP. Now, what is GDP? Now, this is something that I'm going to say most people couldn't tell you the formula for gross domestic product. And this is going to matter today in our larger conversation. But gross domestic product is an attempt to measure the output of a country's economy. That's basically what's trying to be measured here. And there are four things that are measured when doing that. So the four things, sorry here, I got a couple of browsers that are pulled up. The four things that are measured the formula for measuring GDP are these four things. Here they are. So you measure consumer spending, which consumer spending is up. Now, if you read deeper into the numbers and you get into an analysis, which I'll get into, you'll see that consumer spending is up, but not up dramatically, but it is up, number one. Number two is government spending. Now, pause everything here. This is where it gets interesting and I think that when you looked at the first quarter, there was actually a contraction. First quarter's GDP was negative 0.5, I believe. So if you have two consecutive quarters, boy, we're going through the weeds here now. If you have two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, that means that the economy is technically shrinking. The economy is outputting less than it did the formula shows that it's actually shrinking. It's smaller. It's going in the wrong direction, if you will. So, but two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is technically a recession. Now, pause here. Again, I know we're in a lot of pauses, but pause here. If you remember when Biden was president, we had technically two, I believe. It was really close if we didn't, but I think there were two negative GDP growth quarters. And that's when the media and that's when the talking heads started trying to redefine what a recession was, because they didn't want Biden going into 2024 having to deal with the fact that he presided over a recession. That's not good, right? That's not good for the country. That's also, more importantly, to the left and to the politicians out there, to the 7 pillars of propaganda that are trying to mislead us on a daily basis. It's very bad for them because it hurts the chance of their guy, their party, their political party, of getting elected or reelected in this case. So GDP measures the economy. The four things that they measure: consumer spending, government spending, net exports, and then total investment. That's what they measure. Now, I paused this on government spending too. First quarter GDP growth, government spending, I believe, was down. That was a factor in the GDP being negative. Now, it wasn't the only factor, but nonetheless, it was a factor. Now, as people who want smaller government, we say, hey, let's shrink that spending. Let's at least shrink it so that it's not running at a deficit, right? We shouldn't be taking in less than we're spending constantly. That's incredibly unhealthy for any person, organization, or nation. And so, these things, there's context around these things, right? Consumer spending is good. That means people have faith in the economy. If it's increased, or if it's growing and people are spending more money. Of course, there's a point where you can spend too much as a consumer too. I'm just saying that there's context, and these things are complicated at some point. But context certainly matters here. So we want government spending to be reined in, but in doing so, it could have an impact on the GDP. I might have mentioned that after the first quarter GDP report came out, but I didn't harp on that, I should say. So consumer spending, government spending, net exports, and total investment. Now, two things here. Net exports and total investment. So net exports, that, of course, has been impacted by the tariffs. And that's why, so now you have people that suddenly want to give you context. I just want to, again, paint a fair picture here. The fair picture, as far as I'm concerned, is that when the numbers are not good and a Democrat's in office or a Democrat is in a position to be blamed politically, we have the media and the talking heads, the 7 pillars of propaganda, as I talk about on this program. People in media, that's one of the pillars. People in government, that's one of the pillars. People in entertainment, whoever. They're out there to try to deceive us. They want us to believe that their side is always doing things well, that conservatives, Republicans are just destroying the world, the planet, everything else, creating little Nazis out there, creating authoritarian regimes and that sort of stuff. Of course, nothing can be further from the truth, but this is how they operate. So when Biden has negative GDPs and we're talking about recession and all that, they'll redefine the term. Right? They will say, well, that's not really what a recession is, even though it is. It's 2 consecutive quarters where there's negative GDP. That's exactly what that means. I remember talking about that on this program. But the GDP for Trump is literally, it came out at 3%. 3% annualized. So if you take the rate of the growth in the second quarter and you calculate that over as though it was consistent for 4 quarters, that's 3% GDP. Growth. That is good. But now suddenly they want to give you context. I'm not against context, but I'm in favor of context at all points along this path, even when it doesn't necessarily help me. But this is worth at least noting because we know net exports is part of that formula to calculate GDP. So when you realize what happened because of the tariffs Trump has implemented, then you will see that it does impact it. But at the same time, the GDP is still legitimately, no cooking of the books, legitimately 3%. Now, on top of that, the GDP was predicted to be, by the analysts, by the experts, they do this all the time. There's a projection out there for Q3 GDP, what it's going to be. I don't have it in front of me, but there'll be projections for all of that. The projection for the second quarter was 2.3%. So the projections were beat by 0.7%. Now, but that's deceiving because it's greater than that. When you look at the percentage by which that is missed, that's 0.7 divided. I'm doing this in real time. So the GDP total output, when you think about how much they missed it by, the numbers are 30% better, 30% higher than what they told us it would be, what they predicted. Now, typically what happens when Democrats are in office, they give us a number. Now, these numbers can later be, this number can be adjusted over the course of time as they continue. This is the initial report. Over time, this number might turn out to be 2.8% or 3.2% or some other number. But right now, that's what they've calculated it to be. Side note, when Democrats are in office, typically they'll say, oh, wow, GDP was 2%. And then after you forget about that quarter and you're on to the next quarter, you realize, oh, GDP was actually 1.8% or whatever it is, maybe more than that. So, but it's not just moving from 2.3 to 3%. That sounds small. But when you realize as a total percentage of how much they missed that actual number by, it's over 30%. The difference between moving from 50% more, for example, than 2.3% would be, what is that, 1.15%. So that would have put us at 3.45%. If it would have been 3.5%, it would have been a 50% miss, right? So we have to think in those terms. That's a pretty significant missing of the mark, 30%. So them's the facts. No matter what anybody says today at the office, in your family, at your school, at home, whatever, them's the facts. There's nothing that's disputable. Now, there's context, and you can argue about what this really means and all that sort of thing. But the context, or the facts are, the GDP grew 3%. The estimate was for GDP to grow 2.3%. 3% GDP growth is good. It's strong. It's a very strong indicator. But now comes the but, right? The but. And that's what I want to get into here next, where the left and the media are now suddenly, again, when the Democrats in office, they try to say how great it is or how it's not as bad as the number really makes it sound. When a Republican's in office, you can take this to the bank. When a Republican's in office, they try to delegitimize, right? We're not in a recession, but we're headed towards one, right? Or meanwhile, you're in a recession when Biden's president. They'll tell you, well, that's not really what a recession is. It's a remarkable thing, and I don't know how independent, free-thinking people can ever fall into this trap. These people are so duplicitous and deceptive, these people in the media. It's truly unbelievable to me. So I want to pick up there in a moment. But friends, I have to remind you that MyPillow had another big order, a huge order that was canceled by a retail store, outlet. This has happened at least one other time since our partnership we've been partnered now for almost 2.5 years, not quite. So that left them with a lot of extra MyPillows, and that means that you are now going to be able to get the classic collection of MyPillows for wholesale prices. That means you can get a standard MyPillow for $19.98, and you could also get queen-size pillows from $24.98, king-size from $29.98, even body pillows for $39.98, and their multi-use MyPillow for $12.98. So to get these specials, to take advantage of this wholesale offer, this is for a limited time until this particular order, this run that they've made, until it's gone. But you can go to mypillow.com. You can use promo code Todd, and you'll get these savings. You'll get discounts on other products if you're shopping there as well. Also, you can get $100 in free digital gifts when your order is $75 or more. So check it out, mypillow.com. Promo code Todd gets you those discounts and access to those digital gifts if you spend $75 to get the $100 in free digital gifts. All right, so that being said, here we go. I want to read marketplace.org. See what they have to say here about the GDP. Headlines, strong second quarter GDP growth numbers are misleading, say the experts. By the way, the same experts that told us the GDP was going to be 2.3%. It's now 3%. They didn't say, wow, it's amazing that we underestimated it by 30%. No, that's not what's misleading here. What's misleading here to the experts is that the GDP really isn't as good as it sounds like it is. That's what they want you to believe. The same experts who probably told you that when Biden had the 2 negative quarters of GDP, that was not a recession, and they truly tried to just redefine it in real time. Subheadline here says the economy is hot, but maybe not as hot as it looks. This is every single time. Here we go. The size of the U.S. economy grew in the second quarter of this year by a lot, 3% annualized. That's after it contracted in the first quarter by 0.5%. But as so often the case in economics and elsewhere, looks can be deceiving. Suddenly they care about context. 3% GDP growth is pretty great, pretty solid. It's just that, as Thomas Ryan put it, that figure is very misleading. Ryan is a North America economist with capital economics. He said the 3% figure is sort of driven by a quirk. The quirk? Trade chaos. In the first quarter of 2025, companies across the economy binged on imports, stockpiling before tariffs hit. When tariffs hit, a lot of them stopped importing so much. As a result of imports slumping, that's boosted GDP quite strongly, Ryan said. All right, did they tell us that was why it put a negative impact on the GDP in the first quarter? I mean, if the argument here is, yeah, well, the GDP is better this quarter because the imports were higher in the first quarter. And since GDP, a part of GDP is factoring in the net exports. So the less your trade deficit is, if you want to look at it that way, between imports and exports. This reminds me of George Costanza's friend, Art Vandelay, who was an importer-exporter. But when you are importing and exporting, and you look at the balance sheet of that entire thing, and you say, first quarter, we had a bunch of imports because people were trying to get their products here before Trump slapped them with tariffs. Okay. Did they tell us that? Did they tell us that the negative 0.5% GDP was impacted by that? And also, as I alluded to, I think it was impacted by reduction in some spending in the government, which is a factor I would say here as well. Remember, we've got rescissions packages going through to where spending is being cut in real ways. Anyway, I don't remember them saying that. I do remember that now as I'm speaking and going through this. I remember mentioning that when the first quarter GDP came out, because I said, when it is all calculated and considered, I don't know if it was actually a negative quarter or not. It might still be. It might have been slightly in the positive. It might have been right at zero. Who knows? Anyway, got to pause, out of time this first segment. Pick this up, my friends, when we get back. You're listening to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I am your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. Talking about the GDP. Gone through some details, gone through some weeds here. GDP is at 3% for quarter number 2, but economists are out there saying that's a great number, but don't get your hopes up, because that's a little deceiving, because the imports from Art Vandelay came in at a much lower rate because of the tariffs. And so that actually skewed the numbers, because that's part of the equation. And so that bumped the numbers up higher than they would have been. But again, I don't remember them telling us that it had a negative impact in the first quarter when we had all these imports dumped on us. Do you remember that? I remember mentioning it here. You would have heard it from me. But I sure don't remember the media making sure you knew it wasn't as bad as that negative 0.5% GDP indicated. In fact, if it was negative again, if it was negative 0.1 this quarter, they would absolutely, without any doubt, tell us that we were in a recession. You know that to be the case. So does context not matter when it's in Trump's or Republicans' favor? Certainly, if you're interested in consistency, it does. But anyway, here we go. As a result of imports slumping, that's boosted GDP quite strongly. That's, of course, according to Ryan here, who they're talking with, Thomas Ryan of Capital Economics. That's how the math works when calculating GDP. Imports are a negative, so less imports is a positive, and GDP grew. What does the economy look like if we take out the trade chaos? That's the question here at marketplace.org. Under the hood, it does look like there's some cooling in the relatively solid growth we've experienced in 23 and 24, said Jonathan Pingle, chief U.S. economist at UBS. So I guess things were better under Biden. That's what you're supposed to. It's cooling off. If you look at it in detail, if you forget the fact that it's a 3% GDP, you put your head under the hood and you take a look, it appears that there might be some cooling out there. Things were better in 23 and 24, according to Jonathan Pingle. At least that seems to be, to me, what he's suggesting. If you want to look at the core of the economy, the beating heart of it all, you look at how much we consumers, I'm reading from this article again at marketplace.org, we consumers and businesses are all buying and investing. At the end of last year, that was growing at a solid 3.4%. Then it slipped to 2.9%, then 1.9%, and now 1.2%. A lot of the slowing is the kind of residential investment and structures side, said Justin Widener, an economist with Deutsche Bank. The housing market is not thrilled by high interest rates, and as far as, well, whose fault is the high interest rates? Trump's out there practically begging. He doesn't beg, but just trying to increase the pressure so high on Powell that he has to lower interest rates. And as far as investment, low oil prices have kept a lid on the oil and gas sector, which is a big one. Again, it's just, I truly can't read this stuff anymore. This low gas and oil prices is now viewed negatively. And I get it. Listen, this is always the case, right? This is always the case when you look at the overall economy. But low oil prices and gas prices mean less for you to pay at the pump, which is viewed as good for a lot of people, unless you're investing in oil and gas. And then you think, well, the low prices are hurting investments. So, but when Democrats are in office, whichever one of those two things is viewed more wherever the market finds itself when the left is in office, a Democrat is in office, that's what they'll harp on. They'll harp on the positive. Well, this is good for investors. Good for investors that you're paying $12 a gallon at the pump. Don't look at that as a negative, right? This is the way that they seriously talk about it. I kid you not. Then if the oil prices drop, investments are hurting, they'll tell you, well, at least you're not paying less at the pump. This is actually good for the consumer. This is just the way that they operate. It's so deceptive. Don't tell me this is straight economics. This is politically motivated. It's politically motivated. Anyway, let's see. So a little bit of the slowdown relative to earlier in the year, but still a decent number, Widener said. Decent number. The big question is, of course, what happens next? Is this just, sort of two soft quarters and then we perk back up again, said UBS's Justin Pingle? Or is this the new run rate, or, which is the worst scenario? Worser scenario, his words, not mine, is we slow further. For now, overall economic growth is not as good as it seems, but not as bad as it could be. That's the assessment here at marketplace.org. I, again, shared this because, again, this is how they play the game. This is how they do it. It's a positive number. GDP is up 3%. Consumer spending is up. Consumer confidence is up. A lot of this investment there's been a lot of investment in the U.S. economy, businesses, that's not yet been calculated for, because it's pledges from companies who are responding as they negotiate and figure out how they're going to handle these tariffs that Trump has levied upon them. That's going to hit at some point down the road for the U.S. economy. There's going to be a blip in a positive direction, and you can take it to the bank if those investments hit, and heaven forbid we have a Democrat president in 2028, but there will be nothing. There will be no mention of that There will be no mention that, hey, this is a big, people that invested in businesses that because of the Trump tariffs, if those things go into effect during the time when a Democrat's in office, there will be no context that explains, hey, well, we got to keep in mind that businesses were benefiting from investments that were made, that were pledged under Trump because of the tariffs, and they've just now basically manifested themselves in some future quarter, and they won't even explain that. They won't even mention that. They'll just act like that isn't a part of this. And that's the worst part of this. I don't mind that they explain this stuff. This is a legitimate thing to keep in mind. But it's also a legitimate thing to keep in mind in the first quarter when we had negative GDP growth because we had, at least in part, so many extra imports. You can't have it both ways. You can't say the second quarter numbers are higher because nobody imported because they imported all their stuff in the first quarter. So then you're actually telling me that they were lower. The number was lower in the first quarter than it should have been. But you would have been happy to report if the number was negative in the second quarter that we were officially in a recession, even though you tried to change the definition of a recession when Biden was in office. These people are duplicitous, deceptive, misleading. My friends, let's be honest here. When your financial world starts getting a little bit more complicated, you need more than one-size-fits-all advice. That's where Full Suite Wealth shines. Their team specializes in working with families and individuals at your level, offering personalized guidance that goes far beyond the basics, from private equity and private credit to options strategies and coordinated legal planning. Full Suite Wealth helps you see the big picture and make confident decisions about your legacy. It's all about having a dedicated team to guide you every step so you can focus on what matters most: your family, your goals, your future. Want real confidence in your financial life? Visit FullSuiteWealth.com. That's FullSuiteWealth.com. Build your legacy. Secure your future. Full Suite Wealth, by the way, my friends, is one of our newer partners. I want to welcome Jason and his team here. In fact, they're the studio sponsor. This is the Full Suite Wealth studio that I am coming to you from, as you hear at the beginning of the program from Glenn Harris, our narrator, our voiceover for the program, voiceover artist for the program. Anyway, Full Suite Wealth can help you, especially as you're moving into building a legacy with lots of assets and managing lots of things. Good, strong team over there. Jason's a great guy. All right, so now, as I look at the clock, I got about 40 seconds. So what I want to tell you, I want to tell you now that I want to talk next. I can't get into it now, but there's a headline here that I will share with you briefly. I just click on the wrong thing here. But there's a headline that's floating about out there that says, this is the Daily Mail, lawmaker doused with gas and set on fire at magazine where he works in a, quote, personal attack. So I want to talk about that on the other side of the break. In the meantime, my friends, sit tight. You're listening here to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back here in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. We're going to get to this story in just a moment. Two things I want to do. First, I want to remind you about Freedom Marketplace. Freedom Marketplace is our online directory of conservative businesses. We started that here at the program. It's ours, by the way. We started that because we wanted to, at first, there were two reasons. One, we had grown enough to where we had enough advertisers that it was hard to find. We had a lot of logos on our website, and I realized that isn't very good. We're not helping people find these businesses that they might hear on the program, and so we needed to create a searchable directory. And in the process of doing that, I thought, boy, there probably are people out there that would like to be a part of this directory who simply, podcast or radio advertising isn't something that, fits their budgets or their whatever, their needs. And so we gave them an opportunity to list their business. It's totally free for you, freedommarketplace.net. But when people sign up as a business owner there, as a person that's responsible for marketing a business, they sign a pledge. And the pledge says that they're not going to support leftist candidates or leftist causes. We don't require people to be in lockstep and, vote alongside us every step of the way. But what we are looking for are people that have not lost their ever-loving minds and who are not promoting a morally bankrupt worldview, which is truly the biggest problem we have domestically in this country, is this incessant, I would say, evil that comes from the radical left's worldview and ideology. Their godless worldview and ideology. These businesses have signed a pledge saying that they're not going to support that or candidates that promote that. And so you can go to freedommarketplace.net to find businesses that align with your values. Check it out, freedommarketplace.net. So the other thing I wanted to tell you really quickly is, yes, I was correct, as I knew I was. In 2022, first quarter, there was negative GDP of 1.6%, negative 1.6% growth. That was first quarter 2022. Second quarter 2022, also negative 0.6%. That's the number. Now, I think that the numbers have been revised because I've seen other numbers, but they're all negative. So that is technically a recession. We had a short-lived recession in 2022. However, NPR, oh boy, I want to get to this other headline that I mentioned to you, but I got thoughts on this. NPR, who tells us they're unbiased, who's been complaining about having their funding cut. They say that they've been targeted because whatever, Trump's a Nazi. NPR.org has this headline this was 2 years ago, almost to the day, July 28th, 2022. This would have been after we got the second quarter GDP for 2022, the numbers. Headline came out, U.S. economy just had a second quarter of negative growth. Is it in a recession? I mean, this is literally the definition of a recession. And now when I tell you that they tried to redefine the term, do not doubt that for a moment. That is 100% what they tried to do. Now they're trying to just compare and contrast and ask yourself, just when it comes to NPR as a great example, as they tell you that they're not biased and they're politically down the center, they're apolitical, whatever. Does that sound political to you? These are black and white facts. Two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is by definition a recession. NPR wasn't sure if it was when Biden was in the White House, but now we see economists tell us when Trump's in the White House and numbers are much, much stronger, they're not as good as they may seem to be. These people are insufferable, my friends. All right, let's really quickly here. I want to give you the facts. This Daily Mail article that I referenced before the break, headline again, lawmaker doused with gas and set on fire at magazine where he worked in a personal attack. So this guy is named, here we go. His name is J. Lee Vogler. He's Danville City Councilman. This was in Virginia. A Virginia lawmaker was doused in gasoline and set alight at his office in a, quote, personal attack by an unhinged local man, police say. Danville City Councilman J. Lee Vogler was at the Showcase Magazine headquarters when Shotzi Michael Buck Hayes, 29, stormed in around 11:30 a.m., it is alleged. Hayes dumped the contents of a 5-gallon container on top of Vogler before setting him alight, according to the publication's owner, Andrew Brooks. Now he has now been charged with attempted first-degree murder and aggravated malicious wounding. He is currently being held in Danville County City Jail without bond. Hayes and Vogler know each other, and attack stemmed from a personal matter, not from Vogler's role as a public official, police say. Now, all that being said, didn't even mention his political affiliation. The guy that was set on fire is a Republican. You go to social media, my friends. Go to social media. Very first, this is on TikTok. The very first comment I see by some idiot, Sterling the Bear, this is what he wrote. This man voted to privatize the only 2 hospitals in his county and voted to stop low-income housing from being built in favor of luxury condominium. No tears shed. This is from the ever so lovable Love Wins Radical Left, my friends. Morally bankrupt indeed. I gotta go. SDG.